The wind out on the edge of the Whisper Falls prairie carried no song that morning, just dust, silence, and the sound of a wagon wheel wobbling like a broken clock. It was the kind of wind that swept low over the hard-packed earth, lifting thin veils of grit and memory in its wake. Nothing bloomed this late in summer. The desert sun had long since wrung every drop of green from the land. Only bone-dry fence posts stood like forgotten sentinels across the Boone homestead, their shadows long in the morning light, leaning ever so slightly east as if trying to flee the land that held them. Inside the main house, the hearth hadn't known fire in 4 days. The kettle, blackened from use and neglect alike, sat hollow on the iron stove. One silver locket, just one, hung from a bent nail above the mantel, its chain dulled with time, but the clasp still stubbornly shut. It caught the light each dawn, like a reluctant star refusing to fade. Silas Boone stood in the doorway, the toe of his boot pressed against the warped floorboard that always creaked when Mary walked over it. A useless reflex. Mary hadn't crossed that board in 3 years, but he still paused there every time, as though waiting for her voice to drift in from the kitchen. She'd always had a way of moving through the house like she belonged to its bones. These days, it belonged only to silence. He pulled his worn hat low against the light and stepped outside. The leather of his coat groaned with the movement. He moved slow, not from laziness, but from the weight a man carried when the days behind him outnumbered the ones ahead. The kind of weight that wasn't heavy all at once, just steady, quiet, unrelenting. Near the corral, Levi Harlan was already working, sleeves rolled, face streaked with sweat and dirt. The boy, just 17, had the sort of energy Silas remembered having back before the war, before Mary, before the ranch became a monument to everything that had gone wrong. "Morning, Mr. Boone," Levi called out, thumping the side of the water trough to check the levels. "South fence held through the night, but something's been pacing just beyond the sage line. Likely coyote. Could be wolf." Silas nodded, eyes scanning the distant ridge where shadows played tricks this time of day. "Check it again before noon. If there's sign, hang rags soaked in turpentine." "Yes, sir." Levi wiped his brow. "Also, mail came late yesterday. Left it on the post near the gate." Mail. Silas already knew what it would say. He moved slow to retrieve the envelope, fingers brushing the cracked cedar rail before tugging the letter free. The bank's seal was clear. He didn't open it. Hadn't opened the last 2 either. What would be the point? Words like final notice and reclaiming of asset didn't need fresh ink to hurt. He folded the letter in half and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, where the locket already waited. Mary in one pocket, the bank in the other, past and future pressing against his ribs like stones in a dry riverbed. There wasn't much on today's list. Coffee, sugar, a box of shells. They were down to 2 cartridges, and Levi swore he heard something moving too close to the cattle pen after dusk. He'd also need flour, maybe salt if the store had it cheap. The wagon groaned when Silas climbed aboard, that back left wheel giving its usual protest. More tired than dangerous, but it had started to warp like old bone. He'd meant to fix it last spring, but spring came and went, same as hope did. The horses moved when asked, steady and familiar. Boone Homestead faded behind him, becoming just another smudge of structure against an endless landscape of gold and ash. The road into Whisper Falls was little more than a rut between 2 dried creeks. Wind picked up as he rode, carrying with it the far-off smell of horse sweat, the bitter bite of juniper, and the metallic tang of old water. Dust settled into the cuffs of his shirt. The sun rose higher, relentless. He passed the old stone schoolhouse, shuttered now, roof sagging on one side. Used to be laughter in there. Then families started leaving, one by one, just empty desks now, desks, and echoes. By the time Silas reached the edge of town, the wagon's shadow stretched long behind him. Whisper Falls had never been much. A general store with an awning so faded it looked like old parchment. One church, one post office, and a courthouse with a war monument out front. The names on the brass plaque had long since worn down, but he could still feel the weight of them. The station stood near the southern tracks, flanked by 2 sycamore trees that looked more like ghosts. The stage had already come through. He could see the horses being led away, their harnesses jangling like distant bells. Folks milled about, merchants, farmers, 1 or 2 soldiers on leave. But it was the bench that caught his eye. There, sitting upright in the shadows of the awning, was a woman in bridal white. Not fresh white, not satin and ribbons, just a simple wool traveling dress, buttoned high, skirt gathered modestly. Her gloved hands were folded in her lap, a small suitcase at her side. Dust clung to the hem of her skirts. A cameo at her throat glinted dull in the shade. Silas slowed the wagon, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. She didn't move, not when a child passed, not when the horses cried, just sat, still as carved stone, her face tilted slightly away from the sun. Something about the way she held herself struck him, like a letter that had been opened, but not read. Station Master Boyle approached, wiping his hands on his vest. "Afternoon, Boone. Didn't expect to see you this early in the week." "Wagon needed stretching," Silas said, though they both knew better. Boyle followed his gaze. "Ah, that." Silas waited. "Name's Langley," Boyle said after a pause. "Miss Etta Langley. Came in from Charleston. Meant to marry Herbert Bexley. Bexley's people. Changed their minds." His voice lowered. "Said 42's too old for bearing and too proud for keeping." Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Left her a telegram halfway to Arizona. She kept coming anyway. Guess she figured someone ought to tell her to her face." "Anyone taken her in?" "She refused. Boarding house offered a cot. Said she'd wait for the next stage Thursday." That was 4 days from now. Silas stepped down from the wagon. "What are you doing?" Boyle asked. He didn't answer. His boots echoed as he crossed the boards, the sound sharp against the stillness of the station. The woman turned at last, slowly, and met his eyes. Her gaze was the color of sage in late summer, cool, unshaken. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." She nodded once, precise. "Sir." "My name's Boone. Silas Boone. Etta Langley." He paused, then reached into his coat, pulled out the small leather-bound Bible Mary used to carry, held it in both hands, open but unread. "There's a passage I can't seem to find," he said, voice steady. "Something about new beginnings." "You wouldn't happen to know where to look?" Her brows lifted slightly. "Are you asking me to read scripture, Mr. Boone, or asking me something else entirely?" He didn't smile. Not yet. Just offered the Bible. "Maybe both." She took it, fingers grazing his. Her hands were steady, not soft, not city soft, anyway. More like stone, worn smooth by river current. "I'm a schoolteacher by trade," she said, unfolding the ribbon from the pages. "I read quite well." He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, leaving space between them wide enough for decency, but narrow enough for intention. Above them, the station clock ticked past 3, and somewhere in the distance, behind the wind, behind the ache of a sun-bleached day, behind the old weight of unopened letters and faded names, something began to shift. It was not yet forgiveness. It was not yet peace. But it was the first page of a story neither of them had planned to write. Etta looked up, and for the first time her voice sounded, "You proposing a prayer or a proposition?" The courthouse smelled of dust and dried ink, and the town clerk's pen shook just slightly when Silas said, "Today." The words didn't come loud. They never did from Silas Boone, but there was weight in them, like boots thudding onto old church floorboards or the crack of wood splitting in the cold. Enough that Ambrose Fitch looked up from his ledger and blinked as though trying to remember what century it was. Light from the tall window caught on his glasses, which were smudged with oil from too many years of unbothered polish. His inkwell trembled faintly on the edge of the desk. Etta Langley stood to one side, still wearing the traveling dress she'd arrived in, though she'd dusted off the skirt and fastened the top button again. There was no ring on her finger. No family standing behind her, just a suitcase by her feet and a Bible clutched to her chest like it might explain everything she could not. The silence that filled the room wasn't the awkward kind. It was old, heavy. The sort of silence that settles only in places where vows have been spoken and broken and witnessed by men who'd seen it all. Divorces etched in back pages, babies born out of season, marriages conducted by force or forgiveness or desperation. Whisper Falls Courthouse didn't judge much. It had stopped long ago. It merely recorded. Ambrose cleared his throat and uncapped the ink. Full names, please. Silas removed his hat. Silas Thaddeus Boone. Etta met his eyes. Her voice came even, though her fingers tightened just slightly around the Bible's spine. Henrietta Langley, but I sign as Etta. He nodded, marking the register with slow, deliberate strokes. His hand was steadier now. Habit took over. Paper made things real. Whether or not hearts kept up. Outside, the street bustled with late afternoon heat. The sun leaned westward, casting slanting light through the courthouse's stained glass windows, painting green and crimson shards across the floorboards. It was the kind of day meant for weddings in meadows or under arbors heavy with summer bloom, not in a dust-slick office with a floor that creaked like it might remember your sins. But Silas had never been a man for ceremony. And Etta was past waiting for things to come wrapped in white lace. Ambrose set down his pen and ran a dry palm over his beard. Witnesses? Reverend Nolan stepped through the door just then, summoned quietly by Station Master Boyle a few minutes earlier. He was breathless, having run from the church with his collar askew and sermon notes still folded under his arm. I'll stand, he said, catching his breath. If it's real. It is, Silas answered, without looking away from Etta. The Reverend nodded once, then pulled a slim book from his coat pocket. No flowers, no music, just words and will. Etta's gaze didn't waver. That's all I've ever trusted. Ambrose flipped the page. You'll need rings. There was a beat of silence. Then from the corner, Emma Pratt, widow, storekeeper's sister, stepped forward from the shadows near the open doorway. This belonged to my mother, she said, slipping a thin gold band from her finger. She'd want it used for love. Before anyone could reply, Boyle tugged his own ring loose, its underside worn thin. Martha's been gone 6 years. She'd box my ears if I didn't offer it. The 2 rings, one slender and smooth, the other thick and dulled by time, lay on the register like offerings. Reverend Nolan stepped forward and opened the book. We are gathered, he began, to witness something solemn and perhaps sacred. Not a beginning, but a decision. Not hope born from nothing, but from ashes. And in that kind of fire, some things are tempered strong. Silas turned to face Etta. His hand was steady as he took the thinner ring from the table and slipped it onto her finger. With this ring, he said quietly, I offer steadiness, and space to breathe, and the silence I live in, should you choose to share it. Etta took the other ring and guided it slowly onto his calloused finger. With this ring, she said, I offer clarity, and questions, and the room to ask what you've never dared aloud. The Reverend closed the book. By law and will and witness, I pronounce you joined. May the dust of this town never settle between you, and may what you build be worthy of the names you signed today." Silas did not kiss her. He tipped his hat again, and she inclined her head, and between them passed something deeper than touch. Respect etched in the stillness, forged in the quiet forge of dignity. As they left the courthouse, the sun dipped lower still, casting gold across the steps. A few townsfolk watched from the post office awning. One child pointed. A woman whispered. But neither bride nor groom gave them the satisfaction of looking back. They walked side by side toward the wagon. "I suppose we'll need flour," Etta said lightly. Silas glanced down. "And sugar." She smiled then. Not wide, but enough. "There's a good deal we'll need, but I suppose one trip at a time." He helped her into the seat. She didn't hesitate, just gathered her skirt, settled beside him, and looked out toward the road with a calm that defied everything the town expected of her. The wagon jolted forward. The sun cut long shadows across the main street, and behind them, inside the courthouse, the marriage register still lay open on the desk, their names fresh in ink and dust alike. By the time they reached Boone Homestead, dusk was deepening. The house waited, just as they'd left it, stoic, graying, its windows reflecting the fading light like tired eyes. Levi had left a lantern burning near the porch, a small gesture of welcome. Inside, the air was cooler. Etta stepped in first, her boots clicking gently on the worn boards. She looked around without fear, just quiet interest. This was her place, she said softly, nodding toward the kitchen. Silas didn't answer. He moved past her to set the Bible down on the mantel beside the locket. "I won't change it overnight," Etta added. "I know what memory asks." He nodded once, grateful. The silence between them stretched, then settled. She opened her trunk beside the hearth, the hinges creaking. Folded neatly on top was a letter, the same telegram that had chased her across the country like a ghost. She picked it up, turned it in her hands, and stared at the seal she hadn't dared break. "I thought I'd burn it once I arrived," she said. Silas waited. "But somehow I forgot." She tucked it back into the trunk, unopened. Some truths could wait. Others had already been rewritten by ink and vow. "I'll wash up," she said, rising. "Then unpack. We can speak about sleeping arrangements afterward." Silas stepped outside, giving her privacy. The stars were just beginning to appear, shy and scattered. Coyotes called from the far hills, and the air smelled faintly of mesquite and old rain. He leaned against the porch beam, watching the horizon. The weight in his pocket reminded him. The bank's letter still waited. But tonight wasn't for decisions. It was for dust and names and rings borrowed in kindness. Inside, Etta lit a lamp and moved through the house with the confidence of someone who wasn't trying to belong, but who had already decided she would. She found the kitchen bare, but intact. Found an apron folded in the bottom drawer, stiff with disuse, but clean. Found Mary's skillet hanging on the wall, still seasoned, still heavy. She ran her fingers along its handle. "A woman's weight. Well cast," she whispered. She turned back toward the trunk and saw the envelope once more. Still unopened, still watching. She left it there. Tomorrow would bring its own kind of truth. But tonight, she'd laid her name beside another's, in ink and in dust. Back in the parlor, her hand brushed the open pages of the Bible. One verse caught her eye, unmarked, yet waiting. "For I know the plans I have for you, saith the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." She read it aloud once, then again, softer. In the other room, Silas sat in his worn chair, eyes closed, listening. The house no longer sounded empty. Back in the bedroom, Etta folded her traveling gloves, set them beside the Bible, and laid her hands gently over her lap. Back at Boone Homestead, as Etta unpacks her trunk, she finds the envelope she meant to destroy, still sealed, still heavy with unsaid words. A nail hung crooked on the parlor wall, the mark of a picture once removed, but never replaced. The morning light didn't ask permission. It came through the gauze-curtained window in wide golden bands, catching on the corners of the room where dust hadn't been disturbed in months. The floor, swept but worn, bore the outlines of furniture long since shifted, and lives long since altered. Outside, wind pressed against the window pane like a distant voice trying to be heard. In the stillness, Etta Langley stood barefoot on the cold pine floor, holding a folded piece of parchment. The envelope, yellowed and creased, no longer sealed. She hadn't meant to open it, not yet, but sometime during the night, her fingers had found it, and her will had worn thin. It wasn't long, just a dozen words written in ink that had bled at the edges from time or sweat. Don't come. Herbert's gone. There's no home waiting for you. Clara. No apology, no explanation, not even her fiancé's own hand. Just the quiet finality of a sister's pity. She read it once, then again, and then placed it between the pages of her Bible, between Psalm 41 and 42, where it would be kept, but never looked for. By the time she made her way to the kitchen, the smell of coffee had already filled the air, strong, slightly scorched. Silas was pouring it black into 2 tin cups, a habit already formed though only 3 days had passed. She accepted hers wordlessly, sitting down across from him at the table that bore the scratches and scorch marks of a life lived honestly, if not gently. I saw the wagon's wheels off, she said at last. He nodded, sipping. Levi's taking it down to Gibbons today. Needs new iron. He's a good boy. He tries hard. Another pause, stretched with the creak of wood and the morning groan of the house settling into another day. I was thinking, she said, her fingers circling the rim of the cup, about the extra room. The one by the east window. Mary's sewing room. I saw spools of thread and an old stool still in there, but it faces the sunrise and it catches the breeze in summer. He looked up, guarded. You wanting it for yourself? No, she said quietly. For the children. His brow furrowed. There are 4 families within riding distance, each with at least 1 child of learning age. No schoolhouse closer than Rockwell Point. 20 miles of dry crossing in summer. Snow come winter. He set his cup down. You're wanting to teach? I'm offering, she said, not asking. Silas leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped against the table, once, twice, then stopped. You'd need books, boards, ink. Children don't come with coin in their pockets. I've taught with less, and I don't plan on charging them. He studied her. Town may not like the idea. She smiled faintly. They already don't. Nothing much to lose. He looked past her, toward the front of the house, where the wind was rattling the shutters like dry bones. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, do what you need. It's your home too. That word, home, settled differently in the room. Not soft, not sudden, but like a nail driven steady into wood. By mid-morning she had the windows open. The curtains danced like ribboned ghosts in the wind. Levi returned with the repaired wagon and a bushel of questions, but stayed quiet when he saw Etta dragging a table toward the east room. Need a hand, he offered. She nodded, breathless. If you've got the time. He cleared the space while she unpacked chalk and paper from her trunk. A single abacus, wooden and cracked, lay at the bottom of her belongings. It had belonged to her father, a schoolmaster back east. She placed it on the windowsill. I'm not sure many will come, she murmured, wiping her brow. Doesn't take many, Levi said. hammering the legs tight on the stool. Just the right ones. By sundown, the room had changed. It no longer held the echo of stitches unfinished or fabric cut too close. Instead, it smelled faintly of ink and lavender. The chalkboard, made from painted wood and faith, leaned against the wall. A vase of desert wildflowers, gathered by Etta and Levi from the bluff behind the house, sat on the windowsill. That night, Silas came to the doorway and looked in. She stood at the far end of the room, smoothing the hem of her apron, straightening a stack of readers with hands that trembled only slightly. "You sure this is worth it?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Are you asking me to stop?" "No." He glanced around. "Just never seen this house so awake." Neither spoke again. He left her to the soft hum of wind through the eaves. The next morning, the first child arrived. A girl, no older than 10, red-haired and shy, holding a slate in her arms like it might crack from the weight of being wanted. Her name was Clara, which made Etta flinch for half a breath, but she smiled through it, welcoming the child with open arms. By week's end, there were 5. Etta taught from sunup to midday, then mended in the afternoons. At night, she read aloud from books she borrowed from the church or had brought in from the trading post. Anything to keep the children curious, the house full of sound. Silas watched from a distance, rarely entering the room, but sometimes lingering near the door. Once, she caught him whittling a small desk outside, the kind meant for a child with big thoughts, and no ink to spare. One evening after supper, he handed her a cloth bundle. Inside, 3 worn books, bound in cracked leather. One was a history of the Western Territories, the second a collection of verse, the third a math primer with faded pencil marks along the edges. "These were hers," he said. "Marries. She was meant to teach. But the war took her brothers, then the fever took our first child, and the years—" His voice faded. "They stole the rest." Etta touched the books gently. "You never told me." "I didn't think I'd have to." Outside, the wind picked up. It rattled the eaves and set the lanterns swinging on their hooks. The smell of dust and memory filled the space between them. "She'd be glad you opened the room again," Silas said after a moment. "I don't aim to replace her," Etta replied. "You couldn't," he said plainly, "but you could make new things grow." The next Sunday, Etta stood in the churchyard after service, speaking with some of the wives, Lydia Cartwright, Maureen Ellis, even Emma Pratt. At first, their words came stilted, trimmed with suspicion. But when she mentioned arithmetic and reading and the children's progress, something softened. By afternoon, 2 more families had sent word their children would be joining. The town was still slow to warm. Whispers still trailed her when she walked to the general store. But the children didn't care. They came with their questions, their stumbles, their laughter. They came because Etta made space for them, not by asking permission, but by declaring the door open. And one evening, when the last child had gone, Etta stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and sat beside Silas in the twilight. "I heard Levi telling the Cartwright that I ride better than half the boys in town," she said. "You do. I also heard he bet $3 on me outrunning Jed Murphy's colt by harvest." He smiled, faint. "You planning on taking the bet?" "I might." She looked out at the wide sky, now painted deep with stars. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The marriage, the house, the opening of old rooms." Silas took a long moment. "No," he said at last. "I regret waiting so long to believe there could be more." A soft sound stirred behind them. Hoofbeats. They turned as a figure approached on horseback, dismounting slowly. The rider removed her gloves, then her bonnet. It was Mrs. Bexley. Her face was drawn, her mouth tight, but her voice held no malice. "My granddaughter turns 6 next month," she said. "She's small, curious, and left-handed." Etta rose slowly. "And I want her taught. If you'll have her." The wind picked up just then, brushing past them in a dry whisper, lifting the hem of Etta's skirt and rattling the porch swing on its chain. She nodded once. "She'll be welcome." Mrs. Bexley paused, then turned and mounted again, riding off into the fading dusk without another word. Etta sat back down. Silas poured her the last of the coffee. No one spoke. The wind didn't press them to. That night, as Etta swept the classroom, she found a piece of parchment tucked under the desk, a folded note written in a hand she hadn't seen since Charleston. Wind didn't ask before it came through Whisper Falls. It announced itself by hurling sand through the alleyways, ripping laundry from lines, and making the horses restless before a single cloud appeared. Folks in town didn't measure storms by the clouds, but by how early the wind started singing through the cottonwoods. It was one such wind that rattled the shutters of Boone Homestead in the waning hours of a sun-scoured afternoon, setting the east-facing schoolroom windows shivering in their panes. Etta stood alone in the classroom, reading the note once more by lamplight. It bore no signature, only familiar cursive in faded brown ink, her name at the top, a line from a hymn they used to sing in Charleston. Then, "Some doors do not close. They simply wait for your return." She hadn't needed a name. The handwriting belonged to Clara. She had burned it after reading, not out of hate, but to keep its ghost from settling too long inside the walls of this new life. Silas had seen the curl of smoke from the parlor, said nothing, and went out to check the fence line. That fence would not hold the storm. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of split plums. Dust rolled in like fog, pressing low to the earth, thick enough to swallow the far edge of the pasture. The cattle moaned, huddled against the wind. Levi and Silas had tied down the feed tarp and boarded the barn shutters, but they both knew it was like tying a handkerchief over a broken leg. The storm would break bones if it meant to. Inside the house, Etta gathered the children's books, wrapped the abacus in a towel, and closed the classroom door. She did not pray aloud, but her hands paused on the doorknob as if listening for something older than fear. Then came the cry. Levi burst in from the back door, face red from wind and grit. "The south gate's gone," he gasped. "Cattle are pushing through the gap. If we don't corral 'em, we'll lose half the herd." Silas was already pulling on his coat. "I'll ride west," he said. "Levi, east line." "I'm coming too," Etta said. Silas turned. "No. I can ride, and you know it. I may not rope, but I can drive and signal. You'll need 3. He hesitated a breath too long, and she was already strapping on her boots. They left in near darkness. Lanterns swinging from their saddles, the storm pressing down like a mountain of ash. The wind screamed around them, tossing grit into their eyes, pulling tears they didn't have time to wipe away. The gate was worse than Levi had described. 3 posts down, rails broken, a wide opening into the dark unknown. Etta dismounted, tied her horse to a mesquite stump, and waded into the thick dust to help guide the milling cattle back. She shouted, clapped, waved her arms, and once nearly lost her footing as a steer lunged too close. Her skirts caught in the brush. She ripped them free with one hand and grabbed the saddle horn of a passing horse with the other. Silas rode by her side, lips bloodied, eyes squinting through dust. "You're not built for this," he barked, voice rough. She didn't answer. She was already moving toward the far side of the fence line, where a small calf bleated, half stuck in a ditch. "Stay with the herd," she shouted back. "I'll get him." She stumbled down the incline, boots sliding on gravel, hands catching on thorns. The wind shoved her sideways. She crawled the last few feet, fingers gripping the calf's slick hide, tugging against the suction of mud and fear. Behind her, thunder cracked, not above, but from the hills, the kind that meant the mesa was breaking loose stones. Silas turned sharply at the sound, spurred his horse toward her, shouting her name, but the wind swallowed it whole. Etta dragged the calf free just as a slab of rock gave way from the bluff above. Dust and stone rained down in a blinding curtain. She shielded the calf with her own body, curling over it, eyes shut tight. The thunder passed. The world settled. Silas dismounted, boots pounding through the gravel, and found her kneeling, arms tight around the calf, her cheek streaked with blood. He dropped to his knees. "You're bleeding." "Not mine." She gestured toward the calf, who was squirming, alive and unharmed. "I think it's Clover's youngest." He touched her shoulder, brief, grounding. "You shouldn't have gone." "You would have." He didn't argue. Instead, he helped her stand, checked her limbs, and led her back to the saddle. By the time they corralled the cattle, the sun had begun to rise, painting the dust in pale amber. The wind had quieted. The world felt cracked open and rearranged. They reached Boone Homestead, with clothes torn, faces raw, and hands blistered. Levi had already lit the stove and made coffee. Etta handed him the calf. "Name her what you like," she muttered, "but she owes me a favor." Then she disappeared into the house without waiting. Silas followed 20 minutes later. He found her in the schoolroom, her face bent over the cracked abacus, brushing grit from the wooden beads. He stepped inside, waited. She didn't look up. "I made the decision to marry you because I had no place left to go," she said quietly. "But staying, choosing to stay, that's a different thing." He watched her fingers still. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't stop you." She rose and faced him then. Her eyes were swollen, her skin streaked with storm dust, but she stood firm. "This town," she said, "thinks strength looks like silence or calluses or a badge. But it also looks like pulling a calf from the mud and not complaining when your dress tears in half." He smiled faintly. "You gonna stitch that back together?" She shrugged. "I've got others." He stepped closer, not quite touching. "You scared me." "You scare easy," she said, but her voice softened. He didn't answer, just let the silence stretch between them again, soft as wool. Later that day, word spread of how Etta Langley had ridden through a storm, pulled a calf from a ravine, didn't flinch when her own head bled. Mrs. Bexley's granddaughter recited the story in front of the class the next morning. Proud and wide-eyed, Etta simply wiped the chalkboard and set the next math lesson. But something had shifted in the town. Not loudly, not all at once. But the hush that had once followed Etta through the store became nods. Doors that had remained closed to her began to open an inch. Children spoke her name without fear of scolding. Men tipped their hats. Women leaned in closer during Sunday service. Silas watched all of it quietly, noting every shift. The next evening, when the sky turned orange and the wind returned only as a soft breath, he handed her a small box. Inside, a silver ring, carved with morning glories. "I didn't have this when we stood before the clerk," he said. She touched it gently. "You waited?" "No," he said. "I didn't know until now what it should look like." She didn't try it on. Not yet. Instead, she held it in her palm, watching the petals catch the last light of day. The next morning, a letter arrived at the Boone homestead, sealed in wax, bearing the crest of the Charleston School Board. In the attic, tucked beneath a beam scorched from a fire long before Etta came west, sat a wooden trunk with brass hinges. The hinges had rusted, the leather straps had cracked, but it still bore initials burned into the lid with a branding iron, initials that did not match any name still spoken on the Boone homestead. Outside, spring pressed soft green shoots through the earth. But the attic air remained dry as old paper. Etta knelt before the trunk, fingers tracing the burned initials, MB, then unlatched it. Dust rose in a sunlit ribbon, disturbed after too many silent years. Inside lay remnants of a woman's life, hand-stitched linens, dried lavender bundles, a child's blanket never used. Beneath it all, a stack of letters, tied with blue ribbon. They were not addressed to Mary Boone. They were from her, all unsent. She pulled the bundle free and settled against the wall, the slant of light warming her knees. The letters bore dates ranging from 1878 to 1881. 3 years of unwritten conversations with parents, with siblings, with the child she lost before the first winter. Words scratched in steady cursive, restrained but aching. I thought I could survive the quiet, but it is the stillness after the crying that undoes me. He still cuts the wood by hand, won't use the sawmill even though it would save his back. He says it keeps him from forgetting what real labor feels like. I think it's so he doesn't forget what grief feels like. Today, I packed away the child's shoes. I could not look at them anymore, nor could I throw them away. So I have buried them in the cedar drawer with the sachet from your wedding. Etta's fingers hovered over that one, a tremble passing through her as if someone else's memory had found its way into her bones. Downstairs, Silas was feeding the horses. Levi had ridden out to the southern edge of the property to look at broken fencing from the last storm. The house was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, for such confessions to be stirring. The Charleston letter, still unopened, sat on the dining table. It had arrived the day after the storm, delivered by a wire-thin courier from Red Rock Post Office who said little, stayed less. Its seal glared like a memory. Etta had touched it twice. She had not broken it. That afternoon, after stowing Mary's letters safely back in the trunk and wiping the dust from her hands, Etta descended into the parlor and stood staring at the letter. The schoolroom door behind her was cracked. The children would be back tomorrow. The lesson plan was written. Yet she could not seem to think beyond the wax seal. "Bad news doesn't care if you open it or not," came Silas's voice behind her. She turned. He held a handful of oats, likely just come from the barn. Dust lined his sleeves, and a bit of hay clung to his hair. He looked like the man who had ridden out with her into the storm and hadn't asked for thanks. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, nodding toward the letter. "You were ready to face a cattle stampede in the middle of a dust gale. Letters are quieter. They cut deeper." She smiled, barely. He stepped closer. "Want me to read it first?" "No," she said softly, and reached for the seal. She broke it clean. The paper inside was crisp, the handwriting unfamiliar. It was not from Clara, nor from her former fiancé. It was from Headmistress Boyle. The tone was formal, but not cold. She had heard of Etta's situation through a cousin in Rockwell Point. Word traveled strange in the West. The school board, she said, had made a mistake in their prior assessment. A new head position had opened. If Etta wished to return to Charleston, her former position, now elevated, was waiting. They would even cover the cost of her train. The letter fell to her lap. She stared at it, heart pounding, not from joy, not from pain, but from the old pull of belonging that she'd buried under layers of dust and dustier expectation. Behind her, the wind began to pick up. That evening, she didn't mention it. She cooked stew with rosemary and cracked pepper. She set the table. She taught Levi how to mend a button. She poured Silas his coffee and answered his questions about the school children with a voice steady and light. But the letter sat folded in her pocket, burning through fabric and time. 2 nights later, a knock came at the door. It was Maureen Ellis, hat in hand, face pale. "Sorry for coming late," she whispered, "but there's trouble at the Cartwright Ranch." Silas stepped forward. "What sort?" "Little Andrew. He's got the fever. Lydia's near beside herself. We sent word for the doctor, but he's caught in Rockwell. Can't make it till morning." Etta moved without a word. Shawl, gloves, small pouch of herbs and vinegar. She didn't ask permission. She was out the door before Silas could offer a lantern. She stayed through the night. In that small cabin on the bluff above Red Rock Creek, she wiped a boy's forehead, boiled linens, sang softly from the hymnal her father had taught her, and comforted a woman who clutched fear like a prayer. By morning, the fever broke. Andrew Cartwright, flushed and weak, blinked up at Etta and smiled. "You sound like my mama used to," he murmured. She touched his hair. "I reckon that's a good thing." By the time she returned to Boone Homestead, the sun was rising, and her shawl smelled of smoke and lavender. Silas met her on the porch. "Boy all right?" "He'll see another day." They stood in silence. Finally, she pulled the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. He read it slowly. "Charleston," he said. She nodded. "They want me back." "Do you?" Her voice came quiet. "Part of me does, but not the part that's whole." He folded the letter neatly. Returned it. "What are you afraid of, Etta?" She didn't answer right away. "I'm afraid I'm building something good here, but only because I didn't have a better offer." He shook his head. "That's not what I see." "I know," she said, "but it's what I feel." That night, she didn't sleep. She walked the fence line alone, boots crunching in the cool earth, stars overhead sharp as bone. She watched the morning glories close in the moonlight and thought about Mary Boone, about letters never sent, rooms never reopened, a life spent waiting for something lost to return. At sunrise, she returned to the attic. This time, she brought a lantern and a pencil. She opened Mary's letters one by one and added her own beside them. Folded pages, ink barely dry, with the names of children she now taught, recipes she'd learned from Lydia, a drawing from little Clara Bexley's grandchild. "We bloom again," she wrote in one, "not where we were planted, but where we were scattered." She tied them with new ribbon, red, not blue. The past could rest. Later that afternoon, as she hung laundry near the south fence, she spotted Silas walking from the barn, a parcel in hand. He didn't speak, just passed it to her. Inside, a new apron, thick-stitched, deep pockets, embroidered with her initials, not the ones from Charleston, but E.L., carved in soft thread along the hem. She looked up, eyes stung by sunlight. Silas cleared his throat. "You've got your answer now?" "I think I had it all along," she said. She turned, caught sight of Levi riding up fast. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Something's wrong," he said, breathless. "I just came from the trading post. A man was asking about you. Said he's from Charleston. Claims he's your husband." And behind Levi, in the dust of the approaching storm, rode a figure wearing city boots and an eastern coat, too clean for Arizona dirt. The man dismounted slow, like he wasn't used to a horse. Dust clung to the cuffs of his tailored trousers, and he carried the weight of someone who'd never begged forgiveness, but had memorized the posture for it. He removed his hat with practiced grace, revealing combed blonde hair and a jaw too clean for frontier wind. Etta Langley stood barefoot on the porch, apron dusted with flour, and watched him come like a ghost out of her own discarded prayers. "Miss Langley," the man said. Silas stepped beside her before she could reply. The man nodded to him, polite but distant. "My name is Jonathan Avery," he said. "I believe you and I share a past." The name dropped like a coin into an old well, deep, silent, and echoing longer than expected. Behind them, Levi held back, uncertain. The horses snorted in their pen. Etta didn't move. Silas glanced at her, but she gave no signal. "Avery," she said at last. "I suppose Charleston got too small to hide your shame." Jonathan winced, just enough to betray the truth. "I didn't come to argue," he said. "I came to make things right." Etta's laugh was dry as tinder. "You left me on a bench with a train ticket and a stitched dress that never got worn." "I know. You sent your brother with a telegram." "I know that too." She stepped down from the porch and met him on the packed dirt. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of mesquite and baked bread. "You don't get to appear now and ask for decency," she said. "You forfeited that in 1885. "I didn't know," he said softly, "how much I'd regret it." "You don't regret it," she replied. "You regret that I didn't vanish the way you expected." Behind her, Silas watched, silent as a rooted tree. Jonathan looked toward the house, toward the schoolroom windows, the flower beds, the linen line. His gaze lingered on the carved initials over the door. "You've built something here." "I built it after you unbuilt me," she said. "I wanted to apologize." She nodded. "Then do it and leave." He paused. "There's more." Silas stepped forward. "That so?" Jonathan met his gaze. "She's still legally my wife." Silas's hands didn't clench. He didn't raise his voice, but the air changed. Etta's heart lurched, and a cold sweat prickled down her back. "I had papers drawn up after I left," Jonathan continued. "They were never finalized. I couldn't bring myself to send them." Etta's voice was steady, but low. "You mean I've been carrying your shame all this time in secret, and the law thinks I still belong to you?" Jonathan nodded, jaw tight. Levi stepped closer now, as if instinctively drawn to defend. Etta turned toward the house, walked in silence to her writing desk, and returned with a single paper in hand, creased, signed, and sealed. She held it up. "This is the Boone Homestead Trust," she said. "My name is on it. My rights are clear. What's more, my marriage to you ended the moment you abandoned me in public view." Jonathan blinked. "The West doesn't care for papers when it's seen a woman survive," she added. "So whatever law you came with, it holds no weight here." He tried one last gesture. "Etta, please, just hear me out." "I heard all I needed in Charleston," she said. "I heard the silence in your absence louder than any confession now." Silas moved beside her. "She's not the woman you left," he said. "She's stronger now. We all are." Jonathan looked between them, then down at his boots. "I'll go," he whispered. "No," said Etta. "You'll stay for supper." Silas blinked. Jonathan looked stunned. "You'll sit at our table," she continued, voice calm. "Not as my husband, but as a man come to learn what decency, truly, looks like." It was not forgiveness. It was judgment wrapped in hospitality. That night, the table was full. Cornbread, stew, coffee that never cooled. Jonathan sat at one end, uncomfortable, hands folded too neatly. Levi asked him quiet questions. Silas watched without smiling. Etta served the meal like a judge passing sentence. When the plates were cleared, Jonathan stood. "I'll ride at first light," he said. She nodded. "See to it." He hesitated, then added, "There's a woman in Rockwell, widowed last year. She reminded me of you. I left her too." Etta's eyes didn't soften. "You'll find her," she said. "And maybe if you're lucky, she'll have more mercy than I had reason to." In the morning, his horse was gone before the rooster crowed. They found a note on the porch, folded once. "Tell the wind I heard it this time." It bore no signature. Etta burned it beside Mary Boone's last letter. A week later, the church bell rang, twice in one morning. The first was for Levi's apprenticeship, officially signed and witnessed. He would begin work under Silas with full share in the spring. He walked taller after that, used ma'am and sir less often, and smiled more when no one was looking. The second ring was for something older, the dedication of the new school building, funded partially by the townsfolk, but mostly from Etta's private savings. She wore the blue silk gown for the dedication, not the one from Charleston, but one stitched by Lydia Cartwright and Maureen Ellis. The mayor gave a speech, but it was the children who said the real words. They'd painted signs that read, "Miss Langley taught us the truth doesn't rust." Etta wept quietly behind her gloves. That night, Silas stood beside her in the garden. "You're still holding something," he said. "I'm waiting," she replied. "For what?" She looked to the cottonwoods, where a soft wind stirred the leaves. Somewhere near the south fence, morning glories bloomed. "For the wind to tell me it's all right to begin." He reached into his coat, pulled out a small box. She opened it to find a second ring, this one made of iron, hammered by Levi himself. Inside it, a single word was etched. Begin. She didn't need to try it on. She took his hand instead. The moon rose. The wind stilled. The town no longer whispered her name. It spoke it, clear and steady, like a hymn finally remembered. Somewhere, under the wide and watching sky of the Arizona Territory, where the wind still combs through the cottonwoods and the dust carries stories older than names, there lingers a kind of silence, not born of forgetting, but of remembering too much, where ghost lanterns sway on crooked porch beams, and the rustle of morning glories against dry boards tells of a woman who once stood in the face of abandonment and did not flinch, who gathered her own bones from the ashes of disgrace and built something tender from what the world deemed unsalvageable. The old Boone homestead still breathes, not through bricks or timbers, but in the sound of children's laughter drifting from the schoolhouse, in the deep groove of boot prints worn into the earth between stable and stove, in the faint scent of lavender from a folded handkerchief tucked inside a drawer that no longer locks. And though some would say the past is dead, buried beneath contracts and silence, this land knows better. It remembers the weight of old letters left unsent, the tremble in a woman's voice as she refused to be erased, the shiver in a man's hands as he carved a ring from iron, not to claim, but to begin again. There are stories the wind does not repeat, but it carries their shape in its breath, whispers them to the soil where flowers grow from grief, where honor may be buried, but not erased, where a woman's dignity can outlast the lies told about her, where redemption rides slower than vengeance but arrives with steadier reins. And in the hush between twilight and stars, you might still hear the echo of hooves in the dry grass, or see the flicker of lamplight through a schoolhouse window, because justice may not shout, but it settles like dew on old ground, quiet and complete, and the truth, when tended, blooms without permission, needing no applause, just one steadfast hand to guard it. If you felt the wind pause as you listened, if your heart stirred at the memory of a blue dress never worn in Charleston but danced in beneath desert moonlight, then you, too, carry a piece of that quiet gospel, the belief that no soul is too weathered to rise, that a forgotten woman may still save a generation of kindness, that the sharpest truths need not be shouted to be heard, they need only be kept with honor. And if you believe, even now, that dignity is not given but reclaimed, that love is not always new but sometimes restored, then leave behind a trace, a word, a sign, a lantern in your window, and know that you walk the same path as Etta Langley, who was left behind and yet walked ahead, who was never less than whole, even when the world refused to see it. My friend, if this story stirred something old and sacred in your bones, I ask you gently to let it show. Leave a quiet mark, click the like if it moved you, and subscribe to our channel so you'll be here for the next tale we unfold by firelight. For out here, in the great hush of the West, where stories settle like dust on saddle leather and moonlight over tombstones, it matters that we remember, because stories like this aren't just told, they're kept, and in keeping them, we stay a little more human, a little more kind, and a whole lot less forgotten.